In the first reading today, we hear from the prophet Isaiah, and Isaiah says that, God has set up this strong city of walls and ramparts he has set to protect us. And I was thinking about this, and of course it reminded me, and you're all thinking the same thing I am, of the 14th rule of St. Ignatius of Loyola and his spiritual discernment. And you're like, of course, Father, of course, we all were thinking that. What's the 14th rule? Well, the 14th rule is that he talks about, like the enemy is like this marauder who comes and looks at your city from a distance and out of bow shot and is looking and seeing where are the weaknesses in your wall. Where is the weakest point in the wall? And then he gathers his bands and then goes and attacks that spot, where the weakest spot is. So St. Ignatius of Loyola then says, so when you are not under attack, in those times when you are not under attack, go and look around the city walls, basically where in your soul are the weak points, and find that weakest point, and then strengthen that weakest point in your soul. And when you strengthen that weakest point, when the enemy does come, he'll find some other weak point, but it's not going to be there because you strengthen that, so that's strong. And that other weak point won't be as weak as the weakest point was. All that to be saying that, okay, now we need to work on self-knowledge and saying, what is that weakest point in my life? And we kind of have a sense of it, even if we don't spend too much time thinking about it, because we know this is the area where I always seem to be attacked. This is the area where I always seem to be weakest. Maybe it's a point of pride. Maybe it's a point where, I'm always talking about other people. Maybe it's something to do with honor, power, pleasure, or wealth. Something that we look and we say, I'm always falling into this sin. This is where the enemy always seems to be attacking me. And one of the areas he seems to attack us the most is in the point of our identity, where he points to attacking our identity and saying, oh no, you're not really a beloved daughter, a beloved son of Almighty God. Because if we knew who we were as beloved children of God, we would not be afraid of the enemy. But he comes and he attacks us, whatever that is. And it might be a good spiritual exercise this week to be looking and saying, what is that area? What is that weakest point in my wall? And then turning to God, who sets up those walls and ramparts to protect us, say, God, strengthen this area of my life. Strengthen this area of my life. One of the practices that can be helpful to us is if you make some concentric circles, 3 concentric circles. In the center we call the red zone. That's like, this is where we don't want to be. This is where we've fallen. This is where we are weakest. This is where, and you might write down all those areas that are there. The next is the yellow zone. It's like a stoplight, right? And then the next area is the yellow zone. And the yellow zone aren't necessarily the areas where we have fallen or are sinful or whatever, but they're the areas that lead us there. So, when I, for instance, snack after 8 o'clock at night, that's going to lead me down some sort of a rabbit hole of eating. I don't know if gluttony is the problem. So we say, okay, I'm going to make sure I put that padlock on the refrigerator after dinner, but whatever that may be. But so you look and say, what's the yellow that sometimes, very often, though not always, can lead me into the red zone. And the last greens, what are those practices that I'm putting into place to keep me healthy and holy? Might be certain spiritual practices. Might be having good friends to be able to call up and saying, like for instance, if you're in a 12-step program, you make sure you have your sponsor, and you're like, I'm feeling like taking a drink now, and so you call up your sponsor and you say, okay, talk me off the ledge. Basically, what are those areas, those things that we put in place to keep us from falling into the yellow zone and then the red zone? And so that might be one of those things that as we're looking at those weak points in our wall, as St. Ignatius invites us to do, to say, okay, how do I keep myself from falling into this problem? How do I strengthen this wall with God's help? So we turn to the Lord today as we move our way through Advent, and we ask Almighty God for that grace, first of self-knowledge, to be able to know where is that weakest point in my life, where the enemy is always attacking me, and then to ask God to help me to rebuild that wall, to strengthen that spot so that I don't fall into that sin again.